Good evening and good morning, everybody. I'm Rabia Akhtar, and I am Director, Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, University of Lahore. We are meeting here today for the second session of the three-day webinar series on post-corona global scenario, challenges and opportunities, organized by Lahore Center for Peace Research. Our session today is titled The Likely Impact of COVID-19 on Global Economy. I'm joined today by an eminent panel, Mr. James Schwemlein, former consultant World Bank and non-resident scholar at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace at USA. Dr. Barbara Wine will be joining us soon, professor at American University, Washington, D.C. Mrs. Nermina Gasimova, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Economic and Social Development, and Mr. Leonid Savin, Chief Editor of Geopolitica, Russia. Thank you so much for joining me here. The way this session has been formatted is that I would request all the participants present here today to post their questions for the panelists in the chat box. Your videos and mics will remain closed. Opening remarks will be made by all the panelists after I set the context for today's session. And then I'll be inviting the panelists one by one. To set the context, may I request, Leonid, please mute your mic at your end, please. Thank you. To set the context for global economy and how COVID is affecting it all, the pandemic has taken all the countries by storm, and that too indiscriminately. Developed and developing countries alike are finding it difficult to deal with the fast spreading menace. Many have started calling it as the non-traditional security threat, also a non-kinetic weapon. Analysis pour in daily about how the world order will look like once the pandemic is over. The fast-paced world as we know it has grounded to a halt. It has stopped moving. All this is affecting lives and livelihoods. All this indeed continues to have an effect on economic landscapes at the macro and micro levels. But central to any discussion on global politics, stability, and conflict is an analysis of the implications of the pandemic on global economy. There are a number of questions that need to be answered and looked into. The foremost point that we must address is that will COVID-19 cause economic recessions only, or are we headed towards a depression? Will the blows to economies around the world result in cyclical slumps, or will the effects be long-term? Most of this will hinge upon the institutional capacities of states to bounce back, restore the confidence of the consumers and producers. And a lot of it will also depend on how effectively countries will protect their key economic propellants and resources during this pandemic. For developing countries, the choice will be between saving populations from the virus and avoiding deaths due to the resultant economic halts and shocks. Also, a lot will depend on the length of the pandemic. The longer it persists, the more difficult it will be to stop this recession from sliding into a depression. And this slide, mind you, will also be determined by how powerful countries like the U.S. fare during the pandemic. A greatly dilapidated US economy would be bad news for us all, given the centrality of the US dollar. Among the businesses that we'll see boost are online businesses and thriving e-commerce and healthcare sector. The demand for the production of protective gears, ventilators, and other essentials will increase. Spendings on defense will also likely shift towards health and healthcare going forward. We should be prepared to be afflicted with the productivity and employment dilemma as we go forward with this pandemic. In the times to come, productivity and production costs will be mitigated by setting up human-less industries. While those robots may be able to significantly reduce cuts in outputs, unemployment is bound to rise. However, plummeting interest rates now and in the future could also give impetus to economic activity in countries once the pandemic ends. The reduction in oil prices, on the other hand, might just be a boon for weaker economies that import oil. Reducing current account deficits could just stave off pressures on countries that are looking to give fillip to their economies. The plummeting oil prices are likely to give rise to investments in oil futures. Such a practice could then seemingly insulate economies from some of the fluctuations associated with the ever-changing oil prices. Another question that comes to mind is related to the fate of poor and underdeveloped countries. How will they survive the pandemic and also recuperate after the pandemic ends? It stands to reason that absent support from international institutions and developed countries, these underdeveloped countries will find it very difficult to recover from this crisis that will become a cause of various other crises. Rising poverty levels coupled with skyrocketing debts will be disastrous for such countries. All that will have an impact on social and political dispensations leading to conflicts. Debt rescheduling will be instrumental in arresting the economic downfall of poor countries, but it will also create much needed fiscal space for governments to spend on health, education, and economic recoveries. If these countries, plagued by dense populations, poverty, and stagnant economies, are not supported during the pandemic, their propensity to descend into chaos will increase, leading to conflicts. So far, China has shown leadership in two aspects. One, it has virtually defeated the pandemic and is back in business as far as the economy is concerned. Two, it has extended help to other affected countries. The two taken together will help China gain influence and win the battle of perceptions at least. This could positively impact its standing in global politics in the post pandemic world as well. In this regard, the US has been seen wanting and incapable, something that would affect its bargaining power in the larger scheme of things in the times to come. But that's debatable, and that's what we are here for, to discuss these issues out. Last but not the least, travel and tourism will be the worst hit. Will this sector recover? Probably not so easily. Fears of COVID-19 reemergence will keep people from fully getting back to traveling at the scale they did before. So all in all, these are unprecedented times which have changed the way the world worked earlier. It has changed how states dealt with its citizens. As a matter of fact, this pandemic has and will go on to change how state fragility is assessed. The responses to this crisis might change the discourse on the broad contours of measuring states' power. The severe economic crunch will also positively affect citizen-state relations across the globe. All this provides an opportunity for governments around the world to improve governance so as to optimally utilize their resources. Like every crisis, this pandemic also provides a bunch of opportunities for us. To discuss this and much more, we have a great panel. I will now invite formal remarks by our first speaker, James Schwemlein. He is a non-resident scholar in South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and is a former consultant of the World Bank. James is a former U.S. diplomat experienced in South Asia and U.S. foreign economic policy. From 2011 to 2017, he served as senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan with responsibility for regional diplomatic strategy as well as economic development and policy initiatives. As former consultant for the World Bank on South Asia, he has examined the implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative, where he advised recipient countries on how to maximize the economic benefit and mitigate the risks associated with the influx of new investment. He's also worked with the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Atlantic Council. Welcome to the webinar, James. I hope you have enough coffee in you for the next hour or so. So over to you now. Please unmute yourself, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you. It wasn't letting me unmute myself. I really appreciate it, Dr. Akhtar, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks to the Lahore Center for Peace Research for inviting me. This is, certainly a hot topic of the moment. Coming to you from Washington, D.C., we have Other topics that are also, I think, top of mind. I want to talk about the U.S. situation a little bit, and then I'll get into exactly as you described, Dr. Akhtar, the international structural conversation about our economic organization and economic order globally, and then some local, I think, insights that we can glean. The first thing I'd say is that exactly as you just heard, the economic effects of the COVID-19 crisis are severe and likely to be lasting. This is, in the US, there's been a lot of political chatter about what people call the V-shaped curve, which is a rapid descent and almost a precipitous incline, or return to previous levels. That is not going to happen. If we're going to have a rapid descent, then we're going to trough for a while, or a rapid ascent, we're going to trough at the bottom for a while. My view is it will be more gradual in a return to growth. In the U.S., we have a kind of a devolved system managing local realities in terms of opening. States on the West Coast are returning to school and returning to a relatively normal level of business activity. As you enter more in the South, they never really close down in some places. Here in Washington, as I was saying a moment ago, before this call started, we had just entered our phase 1 opening, but that's still a pretty much a pretty close to closed level of activity, gatherings of 10. So we're taking a decentralized but broadly pretty cautious approach, structurally contrary, I think, to the rhetoric coming from some of our leadership. It's a difficult situation that's likely to last and persist, and economically we have to plan for that, both at a national level and an international level. In the U.S., or I say globally, the predictions are, I mean, just in terms of the global economy, we're talking about a significant recession in the United States with negative growth likely for this calendar year. I haven't seen yet an estimate of the negative decline in terms of GDP, but in terms of job losses, we now, I think, have 35 million unemployed people, and 35 million unemployed people just in the last 3 weeks. More additional unemployed people on top of the approximately 35 million that were unemployed in the first 5 weeks of the crisis here, which is a significant increase in employment. We went from close to full employment in the 4% range to approximately 22% unemployment in the United States in the last 10 weeks, which is serious. Our political situation has, I think, among a very fractious and disorganized state of play at the moment, managed to implement robust relief for workers and for small and medium businesses. It was bureaucratic, it was clunky, it was a little slow, but it was remarkable in its scope. Over $3 trillion, $3 trillion US dollars appropriated in approximately the first 4 weeks of this crisis. We haven't seen legislative action on top of that initial, ramp up in the last 6 weeks. And I would just note that most of those relief programs begin to expire or sunset, as the term would be, at the end of July. And this crisis is going to persist, and the political system here, it has to act to extend it, particularly on the employment side, lest the economic situation become much more difficult. This is a moment here where we have three sources of pressure, of internal pressure coming together. We have it's an election year, which is always loud and noisy, and no one does it noisier and louder than we do in the United States. We have COVID-19, which is a severe economic disruption, and we have widespread and deep-seated social unrest on a national level. And approximately 3 miles from my house last night, law enforcement personnel were clearing peaceful protesters out of squares, which I'd seen in developing nations and dictatorships I'd never seen in my own country before. But lest I dwell, I'll move on. On the international system level, my view analytically is that for most factors, COVID-19, in most regards, COVID-19 is accelerating trends, not creating new ones. I think that would be the summary thesis. There was already, since the failure of the Doha round in the World Trade Organization, a broad-based international move towards autarky or more local self-sufficiency and less open trading systems. This move happens to jive with the instincts of state capitalists who tend to pursue much more traditional autarkic trading policies that are self-interested, and I think transparently so, and against a more traditional neoliberal post-Second World War, post 1973 at least, kind of world trading system based on most favored nation status. And that was pre-existing this crisis, but the crisis has certainly accelerated implementation. There are serious voices in many countries, including the United States, calling for at least structural changes to the WTO, and in the case of our current president, potentially even withdrawing from the WTO, which personally I think would be a mistake. We're better off managing some of these problems together where we can, and operating separately where we must. But that's the political reality, and it's not just happening here. Brexit, the relationship between the EU and some of its member countries, the relationship between China and particularly and some of its neighbors, particularly in Southeast and Northeast Asia, and I think also we have to look at the Gulf tensions between the state capitalist economies in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the recent Saudi-Russian split over OPEC treatment of oil prices and supply. These are all evidence of an international trading system under stress and breaking down. I don't think COVID-19 created that reality. I just think it makes it more precipitous. One policy trend that is to watch that is new from COVID-19, but again builds on a trend that was existing before, is an extension of what policymakers and regulatory bodies would refer to as sensitive trading protections. That is, goods that on a national level are regulated in terms of their manufacturing and supply. These are traditionally things like defense articles or technologies that could be, dual use for defense or offensive purposes. This was already moving towards expansion. One of the broad-based in Europe and in the United States, one of the broad-based trends was already to restrict technology exports, enforce more technology controls against China in particular because of intellectual property and because of rights protections and also because of political interests. But this trend, this list of sensitive goods was already expanding to include things like 5G infrastructure technologies. This is the Huawei crisis in a nutshell. But it's likely to be expanded to include things like medical hardware. And previously, I would think common good technologies that something like the World Health Organization or I think respective public health authorities would believe are important and globally applicable. This is something that's going to be very important for national policymakers and businesses to watch and look for. Localization of technology is a really serious matter, particularly when it's technology that can help keep people healthy. And it's going to be a concern here. because we don't manufacture most of the medical hardware that we use, or whether it's personal protection equipment or ventilators and the like, in the context of this crisis, or the pharmaceuticals that we import from Canada and from elsewhere, Mexico and elsewhere. It's also going to be globally relevant because the nature of the MFN-based trading system is we've diffused a lot of this manufacturing, and diversification of supply lines was already trending towards becoming the kind of the favorite flavor of the moment, but we've accelerated that reality. A shift towards autarky and self-reliance won't affect all states equally. Most small states and economies, most economies that don't have large commodity supplies to export, don't have accumulated capital basis to drive foreign investment or to create buffers, are going to be more affected. Those states that do not have those factors are going to be more affected than the states that are relatively more wealthy, regardless of their politics, and do. My view is, although the coincidence of the Russia-Saudi Arabia dispute over pricing of oil at the start of this crisis, of the COVID crisis, created unique market conditions that drove headlines. Oil, natural gas, these suppliers they're continuing to cut production because of collapsed demand globally, and those prices are likely to stay low. The problem is when you cut production and you have less economic activity broadly anyway, these economies are going to face severe fiscal stress. So the question is, when do those economic realities and political factors kind of meet and create local crises? A broader drive towards localizing or diversifying manufacturing and strengthening technology transfer rules and supplies, especially in the U.S. and the EU, will make it more difficult for small states to thrive in a competitive way. And I think we just have to be I think honest and clear about it, discussing it and its implications. I'm happy to speak about U.S.-China scenarios and the state of that relationship. I want to first talk about Pakistan a little bit, and maybe I'll stop and we can come back to China in the Q&A. So I'll just shift down to Pakistan. As these kind of divisions fester and these pressures fester, we have to think about some of the local effects, particularly microeconomic effects, but the local market effects and social realities. In all crises, the haves tend to keep having, and the have-nots tend to get in a more serious situation. Social divisions, expanding gaps between the wealthy and the poor, globally, is to be expected. And it's one of the most important ways in which all economies and all governments and all institutions need to act, is in attempting to reinforce the floor underneath the poor, to prevent them from collapsing deeper into poverty, and which can have both social and political serious effects. As I said, countries without buffers are going to be more vulnerable. I think Pakistan is a country with very few buffers, both on its growth posture, which was anemic before, and also from a fiscal perspective. The government already has a record of unstable and unsustainable planning on an economic perspective, but also the reality, and the Ministry of Finance reports show this, is the amount of regulated economy in Pakistan is fairly limited, and that's a problem. That the gray economy, and I'm not talking about terrorist financing here. I'm talking about things like things that are outside of a tax net, like property or agriculture, or large sectors of the economy, are unlikely to contribute to, although that's their job centers in some cases, unlikely to contribute to a broad-based kind of social political response to COVID-19 because of the way they're structured. I do want to be very careful. I'm speaking here about the effects on poverty and development. I don't intend to bring other political and security risks into this. The other of consideration for Pakistan and for other states like Pakistan is that the external support buffers are also under stress. The IMF has more resources than it did in 2008 during the last crisis, significantly more resources globally. It's the current leader, Kristalina Georgieva, who I used to work with at the World Bank, is very impressive and has been extremely aggressive and constructive in advising national leaders on how to manage that process, the crisis, and how to think through their options. And the IMF has done a great job in globally examining implications and then trying to kind of cross-fertilize best practices. So that's something to watch. But IMF is somewhat crippled by significant political disconnections among its board. China-U.S. rivalry, agitation among the G7, which all of whom are key board members and financial contributors, generally listlessness on the part of Washington towards international institutions, if not outright antipathy at times. These are all things that make the IMF's job harder. And in Pakistan's case, a country that relies on the IMF more than almost anyone except for maybe Argentina, it just creates additional stress points to think about. In the case of Pakistan's kind of slow return to normal economic activity, as I think you can predict, I would say first and foremost the priority has to be domestic stimulus of the real economy. You can be the Prime Minister has been seemingly from afar, it appears, sometimes rhetorically aggressive and sometimes rhetorically passive, broadly inconsistent. He's not unique. Many world leaders, including the President of the United States, are very hot and cold about the treatment of this crisis. But stimulating domestic economic activity is critical, particularly to building and reinforcing that floor, as is addressing the social safety net gaps. Health structure globally are under strain, but also things like social welfare, direct cash payments, and things that education programs, the conversation that Dr. Akhtar and I were having before about school closures on a protracted basis. These are all serious and likely to be persistent effects that we're going to have to manage, and national institutions have to deal with it. In the case of Pakistan, also in the case of the United States, one of the things to watch is that the adoption of technology, of advanced communications technology, is accelerating. That is great for elites who can hop on Zoom calls and do web panels. It's not great for the rest of the world, really. And the conversation about the future of work, which I think has been politically treated as a future of work conversation, a future conversation. Tomorrow's problem is very much today's problem. In neighborhoods where I live, we now have robots delivering packages. That didn't exist 10 weeks ago. It happens now. The adoption of e-commerce technology is shifting the game in developed countries, and my fear is that that's both going to leave behind workers and also accentuate the gap between the haves and the have-nots, as I said earlier. And that's and then the last thing I'll say about Pakistan, and again I think this is generalizable, is that in crises there are always risks of losing ground, and there are, as I think Dr. Akhtar said in their opening, there are also always opportunities to gain. And I would frame the policy, from a policy perspective, I would frame this crisis as a potential opportunity for policymakers to take advantage and leapfrog from a regulatory and commercial perspective, rival economies that that manage the crisis less well. You don't want to be one of the countries that handles COVID-19 from a public health perspective poorly and handles the economic implications of the crisis poorly, because the result is going to be more poverty, more social unrest, less political cohesion, and more instability. You want to be an economy that does its best on the public health side, understanding that there are a lot of natural pressures to continue to as we would say, open, to continue engaging economically, and you also have to manage the economic policy side. So I would urge policymakers to take advantage of low commodity prices, of collapsed commodity demand, to get rid of subsidies, to remove price controls, to buy space that you can then use later when in terms of taking the shackles off of growth. In the case of Pakistan, that will have significant returns in terms of transforming the public health and economic realities going forward. But it also would position Pakistan to, as the global economy, as I talked about earlier, as the global economy starts to move towards a diversification strategy, Pakistan is hopefully going to position itself to be one of the contributors to that diversification, one of the potential output sources. I will say, I've said this to officials as well, that I speak to American businesses, I speak to European businesses, and about diversification strategies, and Pakistan doesn't come up, and that's not because of what in political science we would call the CNN effect of perceptions of things like violence. It's because when people look at their market calculations, the current factors don't weigh in Pakistan's favor. Familiarity plays into that, but also places like Vietnam and Indonesia and even in Bangladesh are being far more aggressive. And even with complicated political situations, in the case of Vietnam and Bangladesh in particular, and Indonesia, with similarly diverse and sometimes conflictual instincts in society, some of these countries seem to be positioning themselves better yet to benefit from diversification and bring some of the industrial capacity kind of onshore, whether it's coming from China or Taiwan or Mexico, as the case may be, because supply lines diffuse in all directions. They don't just diffuse away from China. China will be impacted, but it's not the only place that jobs are going to be shifted from. And so I would just think about how Pakistan can better be welcoming and attractive to foreign investment. But back over to you, Dr. Akhtar.
Thank you so much, James. This was excellent. Thanks for canvassing the landscape from the US perspective. It's really interesting to see the intersection that you've developed with respect to the election year, pandemic, and the unrest at social level, and also then, bringing it to Pakistan and talking about what vulnerabilities exist in our country, given the entire international environment during this pandemic. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, and we'll get back to the China-US equation in the Q&A as well. I would now like to welcome Nermina Gasimova, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for Economic Social Development in Azerbaijan. She has written extensively on the economy of Russia and diversification and monetary policies in the CIS countries. She's engaged in the implementation of particular projects devoted to social and economic matters. And thank you for joining us today from Azerbaijan, Nermina. I would like you to take the floor and share your thoughts with us.
Well, hi everyone again. It's a great opportunity actually to share with our experience. As you know, this COVID pandemic affected the whole world, and there were like two sides, economic and social sides, that were like severely impacted. So from the perspectives of the economic side, I would like to mention that firstly, Azerbaijan has entered into like isolation period quite early, so we've been like self-isolated since the March. So as it becomes clear, like all of the production, all of the work, it stopped actually, and so it severely affected the economy. And as it was mentioned by Mr. James, so if you speak about the developing countries, Azerbaijan is a developing country as well, and it's highly dependent on oil sector and the commodity and energy market. And according to the fact that in general the situation with oil was like terrible, so in Azerbaijan it is the same, but the government decided to take the diversification policy actually, and like in Azerbaijan, above the oil sector, also we're trying to focus on the tourism sector as well, but as it becomes clear, due to this pandemic period, it was severely affected as well. So the government tried to implement several policies in order like to minimize the damage, the economic damage. So in particularly, as it was mentioned above, so the sharp decline in global economic growth affected Azerbaijan as well, and it was an impact on global market, impact on the commodities market, as is may become clear from the war of prices from the side of Saudi Arabia and Russia. Also, the decline in the oil prices of the American WTI. I'm sorry, that's such an awful sound. Excuse me. Yeah. Also, it has an impact on generally on the foreign trade turnover and the tourism sector as well. So from the perspective of Azerbaijan, I would like to mention that under the degree of our president, so there was like organized the coronavirus response fund. So all of the entrepreneurs, all of the official organizations, they made their donations in order like to generally stabilize the situation as well, to support the entrepreneurs, to support the people who are in need actually in particular. So moreover, I would like to somehow divide and to speak about the economic support package. So it included like the direct financial assistance to entrepreneurs, as it was mentioned, also to covering the salaries of the employers, also to like increase the access to cheap funding. And also to speak about the second matter is like the social support packet. It includes like the direct financial assistance to and subsidies to people who are in need, who are like without work, and etc. Also, around like 90,000 like paid labor contracts. Also, the extra financial allocations that targeted social assistance programs. Also, if to speak about like the macroeconomic stability program, as it was mentioned above, Azerbaijan is on the stage of the diversification policy, and actually we're trying to somehow get rid of our dependence from an oil sector, but it becomes even more harder now because we can't like concentrate on one particular sector of the economy right now, because like as it was mentioned, tourism is closed, and all of the manufacturers, fabrics, they stopped their work for 2 months also, and it of course had a serious damage. So to speak about the global perspective, For example, if to take like developed countries into consideration, such as Italy, who probably like suffered mostly. So the Italy depended largely on tourism sector, and it was also like a severe push. Also from the perspective of the countries of the former USSR countries, such as Georgia, for example, the Georgia is also focused mainly on the tourism sector, and they have to like rehabilitate. So as it becomes clear, the whole world has to somehow reinforce and to process a stage of reincarnation period, and the situation becomes more harder because no one knows when exactly it's going to over. And of course, for example, from the perspective of view of the authorities, they cannot risk with people's lives and just let them travel wherever they want or to work if there's like a risk, because like the world doesn't remember the same situation since probably the effect of the Spanish flu. So like we're in this together, and we have to somehow collaborate and maybe to share with our experiences. So in order like to find the appropriate way how we can stabilize the situation, because like we're dependent on each other. So that's why, like, I guess that's all from my side. So thank you, Doctor, again. Like, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nirmina. I think there are so many parallels, with how the pandemic situation has affected Pakistan with respect to the tourism industry and changes in the global market, foreign trade, tourism trade sector overall. So thank you so much for your comments, and I would like to engage you in the Q&A section later on once we open it. With this, we would like to move to our third speaker, Mr. Leonard Seven. Seven is a geopolitical analyst, chief editor of Geopolitica in Russia. He's a founder and chief editor of Journal of Eurasian Affairs and head of the administration of International Eurasian Movement. He has been the chief editor of Caton Sidon magazine and director of the Foundation of Monitoring and Forecasting of Development for the Cultural Territorial Spaces. He is also the member of the Military Scientific Society of the Ministry of Defense of Russia. He has written numerous books on geopolitics, conflicts, international relations, and political philosophy that are available in Russia, Ukraine, Spain, Serbia, and Iran. Thank you so much for joining us, Leonid. I am now going to give you the floor. Please share your formal remarks with us. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar, for invitation, and special thanks for technical assistance, because I use Zoom application first time and something happens with my account. So in the beginning, I would like to make some comments related to the Russian economy. Also, the pandemic has affected all countries. There are significant differences in the structure of production, the system of export and import, external debt, the specifics of formation of the national budget, and so on. And for Russia, the negative consequences in this case are associated with two interrelated factors. First is sharp decline in oil prices and demands, and second is isolation regime. And it is estimated that the total damage to the Russian economy will be about 18 trillion rubles, Russian rubles. $1 American is 70 Russian rubles. So you can see that it's really a huge damage. But at the same time, the state has a budget proficit in Russia and can afford to make subsidies for social measures and the most affected sectors. So state can too easy cover some damages. Of course, if there will be decision. And Russian government has already provided some assistance to families with two or more children, and to the unemployed, provided some loans with low interest rate for the payment of salaries. and also promised to return taxes from 2019 to small business. And interesting phenomenon has been seen in medium and large business. If before companies only spoke about making a profit with a very short planning horizon, today we see that everyone works for the long term and puts social mission at the forefront. This is manifested in the transfer of funds for healthcare needs, and particular hotels in large cities use it for the people who are affected by coronavirus for free. Delivery of free sets of food and personal hygiene products, and transfers of money for medical organizations. Of course, Russia also fears the second wave of pandemic that could take place this fall. But there is reason to believe that if this happens, then it will be easy to overcome. In addition, a vaccine that has been shown to be effective is ready. The name of this drop is Avifavir, and already announced that in Russia will be a mass vaccination may start at the autumn this year. And here we move to another phenomenon, which can be named like medical nationalism. This is the effectiveness of countries in the fight against diseases, which increases their rating and opens an additional window of opportunity. This is an element of soft power because everywhere it can be used in foreign policy. So Russia helped Italy and Serbia, whose leadership asked for assistance in the fight against coronavirus. There were bilateral transfers of humanitarian aid between Russia and the United States. In other countries, there are some precedents that characterized the executive authorities not from the best sides, and I think you familiar with this case of France. There was confiscated part of the medical system from Sweden, transferred by transit to the Italy. So it was kind of scandal. So this will especially affect the relations within the European Union, which currently lacks confidence among the members. And after Britain left, the foundations of its legitimacy undermined. And I think that domino effect also may to be spread through other countries. For example, Eurasian Economic Union idea of to build Eurasian Economic Union also was taken from European Union. So it's also necessary to pay attention to planetary trends and aspects, all the visible effects. This is kind of house in the stock markets, decrease in bond prices, reduction in war tourism, transportation service, and the main ratings show a negative scenario for the near future. Also, we must admit that these ratings are formed according to the old model, which turned out to be destroyed due to coronavirus pandemic. Forecasts are based on old pattern of supply chains and interest of certain companies, which are now in a difficult position. So if large institutions and banks lowered their forecast for the growth of the global economy, then other national agencies follow in this fair way. An example is the expert report of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where the forecast for economic growth in 2020 was lowered for almost all economies in the world. At the same time, everyone has already understood that the rigid dependence, for example, on China and other Asian economics is too great. This challenge will be answered with protectionism and the attempt to at least partially return industry from Asia to our own countries. For example, Russia is in certain technological and product dependence on European Union, and this is more than 40% of the foreign trade turnover. And China, there is about 17% is a foreign trade turnover. Therefore, from the point of view of national interest, the pandemic has a positive effect, since it gives an impetus to competition. Local manufacturers have a chance to occupy the place of Chinese goods, and the supply of which is now disrupted. There is also a psychological nuance associated with the fact that China is considered the source of COVID. This is also a matter of trust which will need to be restored precisely by the Chinese side, for my opinion. Naturally, if we proceed from the theory of games, which serves as an indicator in business and international relations, then Chinese customers, which include both, for example, Russia and United States, now have more leverage or negotiations. Of course, there is a risk of the political effects of this issue. This is a different level, and there is so-called preventive diplomacy. We see that the United States leadership uses this method to exert pressure on China. And among the important industries in the near future will remain pharmaceuticals and communication technologies. Speculative factor is not excluded here. As in all stories with stocks and investments, now we see the Zoom application in Russia more popular than before, and people use it. But the law of capitalism on supply and demand has not yet been repealed. Many say that the pandemic has become a certain point of bifurcation in relation of globalization, and now many processes will be stopped and reversed. This applies to both economics and politics. And this moment plays into the hands of political populists in different countries. In fact, the process of deglobalization began earlier, but it was not so noticeable. The unipolar moment Charles Krauhammer spoke about did not transform it into unipolar order, and the world is now moving toward a polycentric multipolarity. And coronavirus effect is bring more opportunity to do the world kind of multi-central, polycentric. There are more stringent assessment of the pandemic, which is regarded as ereignis. That is an event according to the philosophical classification of German philosopher Martin Heidegger. This ereignis speaks of the end of the global system of liberal democracy and supranational institutions. The helplessness of the United Nations and the World Health Organization confirms this thesis. From ereignis, you can go to the dictatorship and the state of emergency. In this regard, the reflections of the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who in his works relied on the theory of Carl Schmitt, are interesting. But his own interpretation of modernity is also of extreme interest, in particular the idea of the camp as a nomos of modernity. Quarantine measures really reminded that many countries and regions have become similar to the camps, where it is difficult to separate the law from the norm, the application of the norm, exclusion from the rules, and so on. And the global pandemic is forming a new marker, which will do new lines on entire political space. And confirmation of this strange situation is Brazil, where the president generally denies a pandemic and calls for acting as if nothing had happened, while governors in Brazil demand that the isolation regime be respected. Therefore, the post-coronavirus world order will be controversial, characterized by high competition, both in politics and in economy, but it will push many countries toward minimal self-sufficiency and the establishment of autarky at the earliest opportunity. And I think that need be formed kind of new type of international institution, like in 19th, after the global economical crisis, G20 was formed, and we need the same kind of organization, like pool of crisis management. That's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Seven. Very interesting remarks, and thank you for giving us, an international systems perspective, structural issues that you have highlighted, controversial world order and Russia's place in it, and how it is going to challenge the current existing world order. Thank you for also talking about challenges and lack of confidence in EU, and as to how that sets to disturb the European order of affairs. So I'm sure there'll be questions for you as well, pertaining to this. With this, I would like to open the floor to our panelists to answer some of the questions. James, I would like you to make a note of these questions as I go forward, and then collect your thoughts, and I'll move to Narmina, give you your question, and then to Leonard as well, and come back to James for his answers. So James, as a political analyst, how would you assess America's ability to recover from this twin crisis of economy and social unrest, at the time of the pandemic? So give me your take as a political economist for it. Also, we did not, obviously, you said that we'll come back to China later, but how does all of this affect US's ability to compete with China, China's geo-economic steps, especially in South Asia? So I would want you to collect your thoughts on this. Some of our attendees have posted questions for you. One of them is that when you talk about structural changes in WHO, can you elaborate on those changes, of assisting governance in developing countries which are less affected by COVID as compared to Western countries that are more badly affected? And in addition, from this attendee, has asked this question: how do you see the policy of global protectionism adopted by many countries in this impending short-term and long-term consequences? World Economic Forum has come up with a term called precautionism. So how would you look at that, and how would you characterize your responses in that effect? Narmina, I would want you to tell us a bit about how do you look at the market fragility in underdeveloped countries in the post-pandemic world having an effect on economies that are recovering in the developing countries. So since you are from Azerbaijan, we would like to know your perspective on it as to how market fragility in underdeveloped and those in the developing economies, how does that work? Leonard, Russia wants to stage a comeback in global great power politics. How will COVID-19 related economic weaknesses affect this aim that is based on economic integration and interdependence? So we'd like to have your views on that. Let me get back to the chat. Narmina, there is another question for you if you want to make a note of it. How do you think about diversifying regional cooperation? You can also look in the chat because this is a bit bigger text. How do you think about diversifying the regional cooperation for tackling COVID-19, as we have seen that it has affected different parts of the world in different ways? For example, some regions are badly affected, some less. Also then linking the regional advancements with the very localized, urbanized localities in that particular region to assist economic, political issues posed by COVID. So with this, let me come back to James. Please, I'm sure you must have gathered your thoughts on it. A couple of questions for you guys. So over to you.
Sure, really appreciate it. I'm going to start with the question about the recovery from the current crisis in the U.S., and then I'll talk about the WTO, World Trade Organization. I'm happy to say some words about the WHO, the World Health Organization, as well, because I think they're both very important in the current situation. And then I'll end with the China kind of conversation. So the U.S. has the benefit of significant buffers. I mean, this and by buffer, I mean we have accumulated capital, a highly educated population, an agglomeration of innovation industries and existing capacity, and large resource reserves, both for domestic use and foreign export. Over the last 5 years, we've actually become an oil and natural gas exporter, which had not happened before. In addition to technology and I think the comparative advantages that the United States has enjoyed. I say that because as an analyst and as an American citizen, we tended to rely on the assumption, it turns out, but on a fact set that indicated that our political and economic system was stable and thriving. And I think the growing realization and among an increasingly broad set of the American population is that our political system is far more fragile than we expected, and whether there are certainly external forces helping that, but the roots of the problem are here, and not new. I have great hope and confidence that we'll be able to recover because of those buffers, because I think we have a resilient population, and also because I think we have some comparative advantages to speak of. But the direction of that recovery is I think uncertain. If our political system cannot be organized to continue providing relief in the COVID-19 crisis, we could look back on President Trump as we look back on President Hoover, as one of the whose political attitudes effectively drove the world into a depression. And that's the relative strength and size of the U.S. economy means that we could do that by our failure to act. So far, we haven't failed. So far, the political system has responded and acted I think with appropriate urgency. But the fractures in our society and in our political system put the buffers at risk, and I think pose a threat not just to U.S. economic and political stability that previously we wouldn't have believed existed, but also to global economic stability and growth. We're not the only country that has, I think, is a global driver of growth. The European Union and China are both, significant economic drivers as well, that can have that kind of agglomerated magnifying effect in pushing the global economy towards stability or not, or towards growth or not. But in the U.S., I think we have this confluence of factors, of these three factors that I described, does, I think, pose structural risk. In terms of the World Trade Organization, this is an issue where the underlying tensions, and from a U.S. perspective, predated COVID-19. This administration, and I mean, honestly, all the administrations since the Doha round collapsed over a decade ago, have pursued variations on kind of four sets of policies. The first is an increased enforcement on trade enforcement, is in the parlance of I think the lawyers. By trade enforcement, we particularly focus on the role of state capitalist economies in fostering non-market conditions that we believe violate the underlying agreements that allow their entry into the World Trade Organization. China is the country against whom the most people are aggrieved in the United States and elsewhere, but China is not the only violator of those covenants. They may be the most, their scale may be the most significant, but the problem is not just China, it's more structural. China's size makes it the focus. The second is trade facilitation. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement is the only bright spot in the World Trade Organization agenda and the global trading agenda in the last decade. It's an extremely important agreement, or could be an extremely important agreement, to smooth and standardize the customs and border side of trade, the barriers to entry, the systems and processing, the interoperability of trading systems, and that's meaningful. And then two other areas that haven't been addressed but have been a major focus. One is services trade, which has been outside of the GATT and the WTO system. It is more defined in the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement that was just signed to replace NAFTA than it has been in previous bilateral trade agreements. But global services trade is both a largely it's not unremarked upon, but unregulated from a governmental perspective, but also uneven in terms of its treatment under trade rules, and the treatment of services has been sensitive, both for the West, who have content and intellectual property and other kind of sensitive areas, and also from countries with different governance sets, and it's not a traditional it's not a traditional kind of, let's say, India versus the West trade debate. To take kind of traditional radical views within the WTO, India would be on one end and the US would be on the other. And in most of those disputes, services is a different conversation that hasn't been grappled with. And the final is arbitration and dispute resolution, where this administration has a distinct view, divergent from past tradition. They've tried to basically invalidate or prevent the WTO from running independent dispute resolution as it does under its rules between investors and states, and they've instead focused on both bilateral agreements like the USMACA, the revised NAFTA, and also local remedies, so particularly a deference to the US legal system, which some countries find offensive, as we would in reverse if other countries attempted to insist on local remedies against our companies outside of global trading rules. On China and the US, so significant tensions predated this situation. Just before the crisis, actually days before the beginning of the COVID crisis in the United States, we and China had signed phase one of a trade agreement that put quantitative benchmarks in place to alleviate tension, basically where the Chinese buy more stuff from the United States. That's the glib version of what the transaction was. Even under its own terms, it was unlikely to have been executed before the crisis. It's definitely not going to be executed now in a meaningful way. That's going to set up an increasingly tense trade conversation in this election season in the United States. China is considered by both political parties in the United States as a political wedge issue. That is an area where their opponent is vulnerable. And the vulnerability is not towards being too hard on China. The vulnerability is that both sides believe the other is too soft. This is a race to be tough on China politically. I think there are constructive ways to channel being quote unquote tough and more soft ways and more kind of unfocused ways, I guess. But the tension, the political dialogue here is towards being tougher, not lighter. The Belt and Road, I think, has been a focus and of relevance in South Asia related to CPEC. You mentioned that I've done a lot of work on the Belt and Road and also on CPEC previously with the World Bank. Prior to COVID-19, the Chinese economy was already in in kind of a slow growth phase or slower growth phase relative to its past decade. So the BRI was already slowing down in terms of external capital flows of it, and the origination of new investments. That was to be expected. And globally, I think the scale of the BRI is still significant and something worth analytical attention. In Pakistan, there's been a lot of focus, as this audience will know, on a debate about whether China is slowing investment or whether China's direct investment in Pakistan can be redirected, or what. The scale of CPEC is significant, and it would have a meaningful effect in terms of promoting growth if it's effectively managed, both by China and especially by local authorities. I think on the side of the technical work that I was previously involved in terms of advising the authorities about how to create SEZ legal structures and trade and investment policies that are more conducive to local domestic growth, leveraging new infrastructure, or how to supervise maintenance and repair and maximization of utility of new infrastructure, or protecting labor rights. These are all things that in Pakistan, I think, have not gotten enough attention. That it's not, CPEC could be a positive, but it's not a free gift. You gotta act to earn that benefit. There are no free rides in the world, and that, there's a very different tone of political conversation on the part of the Trump administration towards the Belt and Road and what they call predatory capitalism, and towards CPEC in particular, that is rooted in the kind of U.S.-China tension and the U.S.-China politics domestically. As an analyst, what I'm presenting to you is I think a little bit more of a technically focused view, but I think right now the trend is actually towards Pakistan, the Pakistani authorities and Pakistani businesses not being well positioned to maximize the benefits that could potentially come from CPEC if the situation were changed, and that's a concern that I have, and I think others should share. So back to you.
All right, thank you so much, James. This was super useful, comprehensive answers, and I'm sure it has brought a lot of clarity in all of our minds as to, how, you as a political economist have given us an overview of how US is looking at all these areas that we've talked about. I'd like to now move to Termina and would like her to address some of the questions that were posed to her.
So I will try to explain it more deeply, if we can say so, and to cover these questions in one, probably. So from my perspective, it's not possible to struggle with such like a terrible problem that has taken the global level without like the regional cooperation or the worldwide cooperation as well at the same time. I forgot to mention that since the first days of the spread of this pandemic in Azerbaijan especially, the government decided to invite the representatives of the World Health Organization, who made their statement on the general situation on the spread of this pandemic in Azerbaijan, and also they shared their experiences and advices with Azerbaijan, which probably stopped the probable terrible effects of the mass of the mass infection all around the country. So also I would like to mention that under the by the initiative of our president, so there was organized an online meeting of the non-aligned movement, which includes 120 countries. So they shared their experiences about the regional cooperation as well, about the possible measures to struggle with this pandemic, to share their views on the reinforce of the economic situation, probably by like uniting the cooperation, the markets, and etc. Also, it's like important to mention the exports and cargoes. The Azerbaijan like already become and gained the status of the important transport and logistics centers of Eurasia, and has played major role probably. One of the major roles in the creation of East-West, North-South, and also the North-West transport corridors, which significantly elevate the process of exports and imports and like connect thousands of countries. So also it's like Azerbaijan for now is a reliable transit logistical center that's responsible for treating the role in the pandemic, in this pandemic period also. So one more important thing that throughout the regional cooperation and cooperation throughout the worldwide with between the developed and developing countries, it's important to exchange the experience among medical specialists about like share their experiences and information, because like as I told you, as it was mentioned above, it's impossible like to struggle this problem without any type of cooperation. So that's why I guess I'm like, covered fully. In any ways, if there's like questions, I would like to answer. Also, in the further, the floor is yours, Doctor. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Sorry. All right, let me move to Bennett. The questions that were posed to you, Leonard, let me just add one more question to it.
Mm-hmm.
I somehow have lost your video, Leonard. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I cannot seem to, okay, got it. Let me just pin your video. So I posed those questions to you. I'd like to add one more question to the list, by one of our attendees. How do you see Russia's role in a post-COVID world system now that, the world is witnessing lack of leadership or the absence of U.S. leading the world through this pandemic, given its own vulnerabilities at home, social unrest, economic collapse? We don't see that leadership space and role being taken by the U.S. Do you think Russia has a chance now that it can, use this space to exert more influence? You've talked about how, like China, Russia is also helping countries in Europe and during this pandemic, and that soft power space is available. Do you think that Russia will use this opportunity to exert more influence, beyond soft power, if I was to put it that way as well? So over to you.
Yes, I think, yes, Russia will use the situation, first of all, because it's kind of politics, and not only to influence on foreign countries, but also for domestic politics, because this year also important for Russia in political sense. If in United States there will be a presidential election, this year in Russia we'll have a referendum on constitutional changes. Previously it was scheduled for April, but now postponed for July 1st. So for Russian leadership it's also very important. And now government development new program for economic recovery, one program for short term and second for mid term. And as I already told, Russia provided assistance to some countries abroad, and it's also good for Russian image on the global stage. And to be honest, before in many countries, it's not this year, many years ago, I met people and they told me we need such kind of leader like Vladimir Putin. our president is bad, but we need like president of your country. So now, if our leadership will be smart, they will continue this type of politics, both inside Russia and outside. They will be important to continue Eurasian integration inside of Eurasian Economic Union, and of course, Russia sees itself like influential power in the world politics and like kind of hub inside of Eurasian continent. And Moscow would like to invite more members for Eurasian Economic Union. Also, we have some kind of resistant experience during the last 5 years because sanctions imposed by the West. So we have it, we deal with it, and I think that coronavirus pandemic and post-coronavirus effect also is some kind of negative influence. We will deal with it, and for my opinion, it will be a good experience and a kind of example for other countries. And about global influence, of course, Russian politics is different than politics of United States or politics of China. Russia is follow politics of non-interference. Russia respects sovereignty of every country. So it's another type of approach. So I think this global turbulence, geopolitical change in the world that now lead more to multipolarity, it will be more good for every nation and every country. So it's my opinion.
All right, thank you so much. Again, very interesting remarks, Mr. Seventh. James, there is one more question for you. You might have answered part of it, but you can take another attempt at it. One of our attendees is asking, do you think the rivalry between US and China will reflect on the financial institutions like World Bank and IMF, given the current situation where China is investing heavily in economic structures? And what will be the impact on the rest of the world, especially the developing countries that have their own ties with China? So would you want to take the floor for this?
Sure, I'm happy to. So it won't, so I would say first, my underlying assessment here and policy recommendation would be, and preference would be for the United States to seek a peaceful relationship with China. I'm very concerned about the kind of destructiveness of any kind of US-China confrontation globally, and I don't really see any reason for it. But the way this is evolving is towards a greater segmentation of at least economic activity in limited sectors with locus points kind of globally around major market centers. That doesn't mean the full collapse of the global trading system. I don't expect that to happen. I still think things like global supply lines are important, and I think businesses and governments broadly recognize that. But move towards greater self-sufficiency and a more autarkic order, I think, is likely. When it comes to the international institutions, the question is not about their existence, but about their effectiveness. I spent a lot of time back when I was a U.S. diplomat trying to work with institutions in Asia and in Eurasia to promote a more active and constructive engagement in Afghanistan and in resolving the Afghan conflict. That meant meeting with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and with the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It meant going to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and seeing what they could do in Afghanistan. The best practice from from a policy perspective for the United States is to try to find common ground where we can and disagree where we must. And one of the frustrations that that I think many analysts and many former policymakers have with the current U.S. administration is that they tend not to distinguish in that way between the narrowly constructive and generally subversive kind of policy choices. They let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think the IMF and the World Bank, it's not a question of existence, it's a question of effectiveness. Both have, you got to think about the World Bank in particular as kind of like the development version of a McKinsey, of a consulting firm for governments, more than it is as a capital source. And the World Bank has that capability. You can choose to share a view that markets are good and that social development is positive, and or not. But the World Bank exists and has that capability and has a consensus around it. Countries like China tend to impose limits when the bank goes into sectors that it views as sensitive, and whether that's human development in some cases, or industries like oil and natural gas or commodities or technology. And the areas in which countries have national preferences that limit multilateral engagement, those are expanding limits. But so far we've maintained a consensus. The IMF, it's not an offer on switch, it's more about a conducive general environment that is constructive. In Pakistan, it's widely perceived that the United States has either blocked or not past IMF programs. That was never my experience as a policymaker, as a US policymaker, and having worked for the multilateral institutions, that wasn't their perspective either. The IMF has a view about the creditworthiness of its partners. And it is an institution designed to provide bridge loans and financing and technical capacity to support economies, and then it wants that capital back so it can reinvest it again. And when partners, potential clients, are not creditworthy, it has to make terms that are tough and in order to get its capital return. I think the IMF environment is made more difficult by fractures among global powers, but it's not impossible. I do hope that things like the AIIB, which has been a somewhat a secondary capital source alongside the Asian Development Bank and other institutions in the region, even though the US government opposed its creation several years ago, I do think the AIIB has been a constructive actor so far, and I would hope that it will continue to do that in a way that multiplies the work of the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, etc. Where it gets really complicated, though, is when you look at conflict centers like Afghanistan, where there are very few people who can invest in a place like Afghanistan. IMF can only do a little bit because the Afghan economy is so small. World Bank is very limited in its ability to operate there, increasingly so as it becomes unstable. It's not eligible for AIIB support at this point because the AIIB doesn't have the authority from its board members to engage. And then when you think about something like the North Korea problem, where you have to be a member of the IMF to receive World Bank support, and you also have to be a member of the IMF to receive AIIB support. So you're talking about, I don't think we're talking about some kind of nuclear agreement with North Korea anytime soon, but if you talk about exiting a pariah state from that status, the role of these multilateral institutions becomes quite complicated and difficult. So and great power competition, absolutely, it does not make it any easier.
James, while I still have you, there are two more questions for you, two last questions for you. So one is that, we have seen a clearer environment than before. Climate change is certainly an issue. and this pandemic has sort of overshadowed it. But with people staying indoors and are locked down, we have seen better indicators of the environment. So our audience wants to know, post-pandemic situation, how do you foresee us going back to our old ways of polluting the environment, or will we be able to sustain whatever headway we've made during this lockdown? The only good thing probably that has come out of this lockdown, perhaps. And the second question is that how do you view the South China Sea conflict affecting the economic landscape of ASEAN region? So just your views on these two questions, please.
Sure. So on the climate question, I completely share the optimism and behind the question. There was a report last week that global emissions had fallen something like 17% in the last 2 months as a result of this situation. That is, of course, unsustainable, and because of a horrible condition that this pandemic has imposed on all of us globally, and it's unfortunate. I mean, we don't want to. The crux of the issue globally on climate change for decades has been the trade-off between growth and the climate. And this, shows us that if we sacrifice growth, we can improve the climate, but we don't want to sacrifice growth. So we're going to return to a heavier position. I'm deeply concerned about the policies, many of the policies that have been unraveling in the United States in the last 3 years, locally, about how we treat things like mercury and other minerals that are damaging locally, even to our effect. I will say that several months ago, I was able to spend some time talking to a lot of people in Iowa and elsewhere, and just in a different part of the United States that's traditionally more skeptical of things like climate. And I think that the experience of just the changed environment, of situations like extreme weather events, of exposure to new technologies. Some of the largest wind farms in the world are now in places like Iowa and in Texas, not exactly bastions of pro-climate policy traditionally. As awareness grows, as the capabilities become more affordable, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to kind of shift the trajectory. The question is whether it will be fast enough. And to the second question, I don't think the current crisis has changed the game in the South China Sea. I will say, and I didn't mention it, that one of the sensitivities between the U.S. and China, but also between, I think, the set of kind of U.S. allies and partners in China, is China's treatment towards its neighbors, whether it's in the South China Sea or the current kind of fracas along the line of actual control in Ladakh, or elsewhere. As China's economic capacity has grown, it's invested in increased military capacity. That is perceived as revisionist by many. In a certain sense, the right to swing your fist ends where the other man's nose begins. As a U.S. Supreme Court justice famously said about rights, they can have a military capacity, but when they start infringing on the sovereignty of Vietnam, Indonesia, and the other states in the South China Sea, taking potential oil fields over, et cetera, or when they start, I think, testing their boundary, the territorial limits, and probing, it raises concerns. It's not the primary tension between the U.S. and China these days. Those primary tensions are economic, but that territorial revisionism is a major concern. But more importantly, I think, is the strategic risks. The situation in the Taiwan Straits, for example, could be meaningfully, quickly changed in a way that would be globally disastrous. And secondly, the status of Hong Kong, which is economically disruptive to the whole region's economy. Hong Kong, because of its unique independent political status and economic freedom, has been a locus of regional economic activity, both for China and for all of Southeast Asia and for the world for decades. And as China moves to, as Beijing moves to abrogate Hong Kong's independent status, it's going to have severe political repercussions, but more importantly, I think for this conversation, economic repercussions on the free flow of goods, services, ideas, etc.
All right, thank you so much, James. With this, I'll just complete this last round of questions, one for Nermina and two for Leonard, and will then give my concluding remarks and wrap the session up. So, Nermina, a question for you. The regional organizations like SARC, what are your views that these platforms can be used for better regional cooperation to fight challenges like this global pandemic? Because the challenges are the same for all of us. How do you view these regional organizations and the mechanism that some countries have? Why are they not being effectively used? So over to you for that.
Well, I guess that it's important to mention that the situation differs in the countries because it depends mostly on the decisions of the authorities and governments, how to react and which measures to take. So that's why, just an example I want to use, like Sweden, there was no social isolation and self-isolation, sorry. So this is the significantly differs from the majority of the countries who decided to become self-isolated. So with regards to this, I guess that these organizations and organizations for the regional cooperations and for the global cooperation, they of course have the countries who were less affected, more affected, and exactly this cooperation between them, it can significantly improve the situation because there will be a share of experiences, share of news, maybe some innovations, and etc. etc. So as I mentioned above, about the video conference, so one of the significant ones was the non-aligned movement, which includes 120 countries and also the representatives of the United Nations also, and 17 observer countries who are in the developed ones. So exactly this share of experiences, it may help. And also it's the process of the sharing experience between the EAP countries. So also the cooperation on the global level between the United Nations, between the United Nations, World Health Organization, etc., etc. Also, as an example, we may use the Asian Development Bank, who is also somehow supports and is trying to maintain the situation. So I assume that that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nermina. Over to Leonard now for the last two questions. There's a question from the audience asking as to what can be the COVID cooperation between Russia and Pakistan. So your views on that. And secondly, there's a lot of conspiracy theories going on as to, who is responsible for the outbreak of this pandemic. You've seen, U.S., putting allegations on China, China putting allegations on U.S., and we really cannot pinpoint as to who's responsible for this outbreak. So we would like to know from you, what are your views about it? Who do you think is responsible? You don't need to, if you don't buy the conspiracy theories, you don't need to go into that, but your perspective on it would be welcome. Thank you.
First of all, Russia and Pakistan should cooperate without any idea of coronavirus or not. I don't know if our medics already started cooperation to develop vaccine or so on, but I think there is huge potential between Russia and Pakistan in science cooperation, in industry and trade, etc. So with coronavirus or without it, we need to be engaged to each other, and because we are both actors inside of Eurasia continent. Second, about conspiracy theory, yes, in Russia also many rumors that some big transnational corporations behind it. Many claims that Bill Gates developed kind of virus before, then he developed a vaccine and would like to sell to the world population, etc. But actually, any kind of pandemic and disease, they come from nature. And sometimes it's maybe moderated or transformed inside of bio laboratories, sometimes not, but we deal with nature. And it shows that potential of the nature is much more large than we can to imagine. So it's about kind of scientific cooperation. In this sense, we need to be more open to each other and to make a real democracy club of scientists, and just to protect our citizens and to share our ideas how to deal with diseases and not diseases, just to develop our future. So it's my idea. It's very short, but I think it's very useful.
All right, thank you so much, Leonard. There was this one last question that was posted to me, but I will take a shot at it. The question was that countries like Pakistan probably will have a hard time getting out of, COVID-related challenges, and one of that being, that it would find itself isolated. While other countries will deal with the travel and tourism related restrictions, Pakistan might have a tough time doing that. My short and brief answer to that is going to be that this pandemic has hit all countries indiscriminately. And I do not foresee the world bouncing back with tourism specifically and global travel at a faster speed than Pakistan. So I think we are in the same boat. Even when the post-COVID situation is going to ease off, people will still be very wary as to whether they want to travel. There are going to be more restrictions probably posed by other countries asking you to provide travel along with your travel documents, your vaccination documents and documentation. And the world is divided on vaccination. And especially so after this pandemic, it will be more wary about it. So I don't foresee Pakistan to be specifically isolated, or countries like Pakistan. Yes, economic challenges do remain. And for that, Pakistan needs to find solutions that are domestic, find governance-related solutions, better its healthcare infrastructure. So a lot in Pakistan's basket that needs to be taken care of. But as far as global travel restrictions are concerned, I think that we are in the same boat as others. This brings me to close this very, very exciting and enlightening session. We've touched a lot of topics, so it's really hard to, sum all of them up. And some of you, all three of you, have made, very well articulated comments. So I'm not going to sum it up. I'll just make a couple of points which I think we should leave here with. Leonard made a comment about deglobalization. I think the world is divided on whether, deglobalization is our future or globalization is going to, bounce back. I find myself to be in the camp where I say don't just bash globalization just yet, because I believe that this is not the end of capitalism. This is not the end of globalization. And global production networks, they are highly resilient. And if they cannot find themselves in a physical environment to bounce back, they'll certainly come back online. So that is one point that we need to keep in mind. Secondly, with respect to the pandemic and economic impact, the world is coming together to deal with this healthcare emergency through first mitigation, which focuses on slowing but not necessarily stopping the spread of virus, and second, through suppression, which aims at reversing the epidemic growth. But more importantly, what I want to leave you here with is lack of international cooperation. Without international cooperation, which is by nature necessary during a global shock like this pandemic, policymakers, I find, around the world are finding it a hard time to come together to deal with these global issues and find common solutions. With the economy, the reality is that no single central bank or government alone can pacify markets and get crisis under control. So I think we need to move towards a more international approach to dealing with this pandemic, because it hits all of us indiscriminately. And we need to find global solutions for this challenge. With this, I would like to thank our panelists once again, James, Narmina, and Leonard. Thank you so much for your time and availability today, and for a very exciting session and taking on all those questions with your enlightening answers. With this, I would like to thank our attendees as well, who have posed these questions and joined us today. I wish you all a very good day for all those who have a day ahead of them, and a good night for those evening is approaching. Thank you so much.